Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question which I will flip in right here for you guys. And he basically wants to know, why is it that training to muscle failure seems to fatigue your nervous system so much, but the 8 or 9 reps before it don't seem to? What gives? Good question. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about that. All right, great question, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that you are basically making motor units attempts to do something that they are not physically capable of doing. And that's the thing with it. There's a reason I don't train to failure on certain exercises. And here's the thing. When it comes to your peripheral nervous system fatigue from training to failure, the exercises that you go to failure on absolutely do matter. Some are far more taxing than others, and it'll make sense in a minute when I explain some of that. Now, the thing is, usually what happens, he's going like with 10 rep sets here approximately. All right, when you're working around 10 reps, you're usually working around approximately 70% of your 1 rep max. When you are working with anything under around 85% of your max, you need several reps to actually hit the upper threshold muscle fibers. What ends up happening, you have what's called rate coding that happens when you recruit muscle fibers. Your body always recruits muscle fibers in the same order for any movement you do. I don't care if it's walking, chewing food, talking, or lifting a weight. You have a sequence that your body follows. It always takes the most endurance-oriented fibers and recruits those first up the row. And if they are not strong enough to exert the force or do what you're trying to do, it will recruit faster twitch and faster twitch and faster twitch fibers. That's the way your body does these things. And the reason for it is that the faster twitch fibers actually put a larger amount of stress on your nervous system. They require a different stimulus slightly from your nervous system. They fatigue it more than the endurance-oriented fibers. And the endurance-oriented fibers are made to contract over and over and over and over millions of times in a day without really getting fatigued. They're just a different animal, whereas in the faster the twitch the fiber goes, the fewer times it can contract in a single day before it reaches exhaustion. Some of them only a handful of times, 4 or 5 times, and they're done. So what ends up happening there, it uses that rate coding sequence to get where it's going, and it's always sequential. You can't bypass steps in it. It goes through that whole series of about 20 different muscle fiber subtypes. What ends up happening with a weight that you're capable of lifting 9 or 10 times, the first few reps, your body actually doesn't even recruit the fast twitch fibers. The really fast ones, the last few series up that chain, it doesn't even recruit them at all. It actually starts exhausting all the mid-range fibers first, and then as they start getting exhausted a few reps in, by that 4th, 5th, 6th rep, then it starts hitting those upper threshold fibers. What ends up happening when you hit muscle failure, you've actually fatigued a lot of the intermediate fibers. Some of the stamina fibers are starting to get fatigued, and what ends up happening, those upper threshold fibers, you start wearing out the few that is able to recruit. And what ends up happening, if you got that 9th rep and had you stopped there, your body would actually recover much more quickly. But when you go for that 10th rep and you fail, you have basically a failure of your peripheral nervous system. It tries to fire more muscle fibers and it can't. It actually exhausts those motor units all through that muscle. It exhausts them. And when that happens, they need time to recuperate. And that's your peripheral nervous system. All the various little nerves all through your limbs and through your musculature are your peripheral nervous system. And when that certain parts of it get too fatigued, it can't recruit those muscle fibers again. And by failing to recruit them because they were too exhausted, it tried to recruit even more. It tried to look for more fibers to recruit. And it's almost, think of it, the best way to put it for people to understand, think of it almost as a short circuit. The circuit gets overloaded. All right, that's what basically happens. That circuit gets overloaded, trying to put more current, trying to find more muscle fibers to recruit, and it can't get anything else to recruit that'll lift the weight. And then the weight drops and you fail. You can't lift it anymore. And even if the spotter has to help you or you do a drop set, you've already exhausted them. You've achieved the same thing. You failed. You couldn't lift the weight anymore. And you're having to go to the lighter weight, and the spotter's having to help you because you cannot get the motor units to turn on in any of those muscle fibers again to recruit again. And therefore, the weight you can't lift that full weight anymore on your own. At least with the primary movers, without wiggling and cheating and taking load off the muscles. Now, when you think about it from that perspective, there are exercises that are going to be more catastrophic in regards to that than others. For example, you fail a bench press, you basically have only fatigued the peripheral nervous system enough of probably your pecs gave out or your delts gave out, maybe your triceps, some other stuff, right? You haven't fatigued most of the muscles through your body. Same thing with a curl. You know, the only thing that's you're fatigued really is going to be your biceps. So you might not be able to do chin-ups or rows, but a fatigued bicep's not going to stop you from bench pressing. It's not going to stop you from squatting, right? What happens when you fail on the deadlift? The mother of all exercises, the exercise that recruits up to 70% of the muscles through your body. What happens if you reached fatigue and failure in 3 or 4 of those different muscle groups all through the body on the deadlift, and that's why your form broke down and you failed to lift it? When you think about it from that perspective of all the motor units and nerves that got kind of short-circuited there to your muscles is the way to think about it, and they're not going to be able to work correctly for a day, 2 days, 3 days while they recover. You think about all the different muscle groups that got hit, all the muscle groups that might have been involved in that. Your traps might have been involved. Your traps might have failed. Your thoracic erectors might have failed. Your forearms might have failed if it was a grip-related issue, because a lot of times on the deadlift, when you can no longer grip it correctly, muscles in your back and stuff start giving up. Your body just kind of lets go. So you failed with the forearms or the traps, right? So what ends up happening there? Any exercise that involves any of those is going to struggle. It's going to have a weak link that it can't fire all the muscle fibers correctly in. If your traps can't fire correctly, are you going to be able to do a barbell row? Are you going to be able to do an overhead press correctly? It could even affect your bench press because the traps, are used as a stabilizer in there. It probably won't affect it a lot, but the overhead press it will. Your barbell rows it will. What about if your spinal erectors, your glutes were partially what gave out? Are you going to be able to squat? You're not going to be able to squat at maximum power. You might not be able to bench press. Because glutes, there's actually some leg and glute drive involved in a proper power bench. You might lose 10, 15 pounds off your bench press as a result of that. So what ends up happening when you fail on one of these really big exercises, there are major muscle groups involved that you can't utilize correctly now until your peripheral nervous system has recovered enough. So that's one of the reasons I tell guys, big exercises like deadlifts, do not train them to failure. You need to avoid that, particularly with a relatively heavy weight. It's one thing to reach failure through metabolic fatigue. When you start going over 10 reps, that's kind of sometimes a different type of failure because oftentimes you're seeing some of the stamina fibers give out, a lot of waste products build up in a wide variety of muscle fibers that might cause them to not be able to contract anymore. That's a little different to clear out than your nervous system. But when you're talking, down under 10 reps, 7, 8 rep failures, things like that, you really hammer your peripheral nervous system. And when you're doing that on big exercises like the deadlift, when you think about all the muscles involved in the deadlift and how many muscle fibers you have to turn on and the motor units you have to turn on to get the weight moving on a relatively heavy deadlift, it's phenomenal. Your body basically works like an amazing machine on a properly executed deadlift because you think about all those different muscles in the body that are generating force instantaneously in a fraction of a second. It's really amazing when you think about it from that perspective. But you're also basically short-circuiting the motor units all through the body when you fail on a deadlift. A squat is almost as bad, but a deadlift is about as bad as it gets. It could literally affect your performance on every other big exercise you do for the rest of the week. It could affect you for up to a week. So failing on the deadlift is terrible. By that same token, you can deadlift at a high frequency and not go to failure, leave a rep or 2 in the tank, leave 10 pounds on the platform. And you'll find that you can deadlift really frequency and your strength will go up, your size will go up, and you'll do better. Training to failure on a deadlift tends to be detrimental. But by that same token, when you think about all that failure that happens with metabolic fatigue with little smaller muscles, when you train to muscle failure for high reps on something like a bicep, you don't seem to have the same problems. And that's something that people need to know. There's a difference between going to failure with high reps for little smaller muscles than there is going to failure with heavy weights on big compound exercises. All that tends to happen if you go to failure on concentration curls or incline curls, what happens? Your biceps grow. That's all that seems to happen. Unless you get a connective tissue overuse injury, which can happen, and that's something you need to be aware of if you're doing a lot of that. You do need to pay attention to that connective tissue down here. and make sure you're not getting it too inflamed. But those little small muscles like that don't get used in a lot of things, when you rep those out 13, 14, 15 reps and they fail, all you do is create little metabolites and things in there that cause them to grow, because they don't catastrophically affect your performance on your other exercises over the next few days. Not to the same extent. You know, biceps not going to affect your bench press. It's not going to affect your squat. It's not going to affect your other big movements. It might affect your chin-ups. It might affect your rows. But most people tend to do those afterwards anyways, meaning they tend to do curls after they do those exercises. And they're generally not doing them 2 days in a row, back to back. So again, not as big of an issue with some of those little smaller muscles, unless those muscles are major movers in your big exercises that are coming in the next couple of days. But you hit failure on a deadlift, especially if you're doing it weekly, you're going to start finding sometimes a lot of your exercises are going to start regressing. You're going to find your strength stalls. You're going to start getting fatigued and irritable. Squats can do the same thing to you. And that's generally why I tell people, once you hit failure on a big barbell movement, whether it's the bench press, the squat, the deadlift, whatever you're doing, I usually tell people just go home for the day. If you stay, do a little bit of core work or an isolation movement and get out of the gym. As a general rule, your recovery and your peripheral nervous system, if it was on a big exercise that uses a lot of big muscles, is going to be shot. It's going to negatively affect your ability to perform other exercises. Sometimes even hitting a PR on a big lift will affect your ability to perform exercises. That happened to Brittany today. She got a deadlift PR. It was a 5-rep PR, 5 pounds heavier than she's ever lifted. She went to try to barbell row 5 minutes later. Her rows were terrible. She couldn't do the form. She was struggling with a weight that she has been using for 3 sets. 3 sets for the last week and a half straight. She's done 5 different workouts using that exact same weight. Never had any problems, and she couldn't even lift the weight correctly. Why? The deadlift that even wasn't failure but was a new PR for her fatigued her nervous system in those muscles so much that she couldn't perform the row correctly. And you know what? That happens. That's normal. This happens to all of us. And has she actually reached failure? I've seen people go and hit failure on a deadlift, like go for a new PR or something, miss it, or actually train to failure with reps on things like a deadlift, and then watch them try to perform other exercises later, and sometimes they can't even lift their 5-rep max one time. On any exercise, a bench press, a row, anything, because the peripheral nervous system gets fatigued so much that their strength is dropped sometimes 20%. They lose 20% of their strength sometimes as a result of it immediately for the rest of the day. And when those things happen, that's when it's time to just pack up and go home, because you're not going to be able to recruit muscle fibers anymore. People say, well, you're still going to induce fatigue. Not to the same extent, because if you can't get the upper threshold muscle fibers to fire, are you going to fatigue them? No, you're just going to fatigue weaker muscle fibers that aren't going to grow as well, that aren't going to get strong as well, and you're just going to fatigue those more. You're going to wear yourself out. When you reach a point to where muscle failure has caused you to lose peripheral nervous system strength in some of the big muscles, you're actually not going to recruit the muscle fibers further that you're trying to recruit sometimes, and it really becomes a waste of time. You're just wasting time and recovery in the gym when that happens. Same thing sometimes when you hit a big PR. There are times when you need to realize that a big PR on something like a deadlift can replicate some of the same effects you see from muscle failure. And sometimes when you do that, it's time to just pack up, go home, get out of the gym. You're done. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.